One of the big questions everyone has about the Elder Scrolls 6 is where in Tamriel the game will be based. Indeed, I have covered that and my own theory in another video. Instead, in this video, we will be covering when the Elder Scrolls 6 may take place. We will discuss major historical events that would be a good setting for a new Elder Scrolls game, what scenario is most likely for Bethesda to pursue, and what I would personally like to see. Also, stay to the end of the video for some extra crazy speculation regarding the timeline. So, the first and most likely scenario is for Bethesda to simply move the timeline forward after the events of Skyrim. There is precedence here because every mainline Elder Scrolls game has been sequential and followed the modern era timeline in a linear fashion. Elder Scrolls Arena took place in year 399 of the Third Era. Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall took place in the year 405 of the Third Era. Elder Scrolls III Morrowind took place in the year 427 of the Third Era, Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion took place in year 433 of the Third Era, and Elder Scrolls V Skyrim took place in year 201 of the Fourth Era. Interestingly, Skyrim is the only mainline game not to take place in the Third Era, and the events of Skyrim are the last known on the Elder Scrolls timeline. Now, we know that there have been other games released in the Elder Scrolls universe outside of the mainline titles. These are the titles that go much earlier in the timeline. The most prevalent of these is the Elder Scrolls Online, whose events are taking place in year 583 of the Second Era. This is the earliest in the timeline of any game Bethesda has released. Bethesda released a few other small games, like the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, which takes place in year 864 of the Second Era, the Elder Scrolls Legends Battlespire, which takes place in the year 172 of the Third Era, and finally the Elder Scrolls Blades, which essentially takes place right before the events of Skyrim. These games don't really add to the lore in any significant way like the mainline series titles do, but I wanted to include them just the same. Now, a quick word about the Elder Scrolls timeline. In the modern eras, there are technically at least 5, although we only know of events taking place in the first 4. The eras and years are as follows. The first era starts at year 0 and goes to the year 2920. This is by far the longest era. The second era starts at year 0 and goes to year 897. The third era goes from year 0 to year 433, and the fourth era starts at year 0 and goes up to the events of Skyrim in year 201. We do not know how much longer the fourth era continues before the fifth era starts. Given the events of Skyrim, it is entirely possible that year 201 may be the last year of the fourth era. Finally, we know that there is a fifth era, as it was written about by former Bethesda employee Michael Kirkbride in his script for a digital graphic novel called Coda. It is merely hypothetical at this point, but being that he worked on the actual lore for the Elder Scrolls series while at Bethesda, we can assume that this fifth era is canon. And, if you were wondering why the eras end at arbitrary years, well, there are simply either events that happen that are so monumental that they signal the end of an era, or otherwise they can be ended by decree by the sitting emperor, as Tiber Septim did at the end of the Second Era as he unified Tamriel. Okay, with the timeline basics out of the way, let's discuss some events over the course of the modern eras that would be a good setting for the Elder Scrolls 6. The first one that I think would be interesting would be to explore the events surrounding the end of the First Era. More specifically, the Morag Tong, an assassination guild, assassinated the king of Cyrodiil, King Ramon III. They also assassinated his son, heir to the throne. At the same time, the Daedric prince Molag Bal was summoned and destroyed Gil Vardel, a town in southern Velenwood. And on top of that, Mehrunes Dagon, another Daedric prince, destroyed Mournhold, the capital city of Morrowind, before being banished back to oblivion. With the Ramon dynasty over, Versidue Shahi assumed the imperial throne and declared the First Era over and that the Second Era had begun. So yeah, a lot is going on here, but it seems like an awesome historical setting to have an Elder Scrolls game take place in. Daedric princes, banishment to oblivion, multiple assassinations, and destruction of cities. This time period has it all. And, if you played Oblivion, you know Mehrunes Dagon would return later in the timeline. A little more mundane, but still significant, would be an Elder Scrolls game set around the year 321 of the Second Era. This is when the Guilds Act is passed. Once the Act passed, all kinds of guilds were officially sanctioned. These include the ones we all know about, like the Fighters Guild and the Mages Guild, but also included many other guilds such as healers, architects, scribes, astrologers, cooks, and many more. I think it would be interesting to set an Elder Scrolls game around this time so the player could be instrumental in starting multiple guilds. Another interesting time period is around the year 895 of the Second Era, when Emperor Tiber Septim starts his conquest, or what would later be known as the unification, of Tamriel. This took several years, and once complete, Tiber Septim declared the end of the Second Era and the beginning of the Third. So this would be a very ambitious game if Bethesda wanted to cover the entire campaign. Otherwise, they could focus on one of the main battles in whatever part of Tamriel they are focusing on. Next, this is something I would personally very much like to see. Now, if you have been with the channel for a little bit, you will know that one of my favorite events in Elder Scrolls lore is the disappearance of the Dwemer. This happened far away from where the Elder Scrolls 6 is rumored to be taking place, but it would be an incredibly interesting sequence of events to cover, while also finally answering the question, potentially anyway, of what happened to the Dwemer. You see, this all happened in concert with the Battle of Red Mountain in Vardenfell, and it happened fairly early in the First Era, around year 700. This story is incredibly compelling because not only does it include the disappearance of the Dwemer, but the war was between the Chimer and the Dwemer, with Nords, Orcs, and even Khajiit reportedly fighting as well. There were all kinds of conflicting reports about this battle, but being able to witness or even take part in it, while also seeing what happened to the Dwemer, would be a perfect setting to an Elder Scrolls game, in my opinion. Okay, so if you stayed to the end, I have one last sort of crazy thought for where to place the next Elder Scrolls game. I am talking about the Prehistoric Eras. These are broken up into two distinct time frames, those being the Dawn Era and the Maratha Era. There's not much information on either era outside of their existence, and especially the Dawn Era. That said, the Maratha Era could be a very interesting setting. Here's what the Elder Scrolls Wiki describes as having happened during the Maratha Era, which starts in the year 2500 and lasts until year 0 of the first modern era. Quote, "Linear time can finally be discerned, and the Marathic Era begins in ME 2500 with the construction of the Adamantine Tower following the defeat of Lorkhan and the subsequent creation of Red Mountain. The elven races thrive during this time, as the Aldmar explore northern Tamriel and the Iliads establish a sprawling empire in the heart of the continent. The era finally ends in ME1 with the founding of the Camoran dynasty." End quote. So all kinds of interesting things are going on, and the construction of the Adamantine Tower is an awesome piece of lore that is said to extend as far into the ground as it does tower above it. It hasn't been explored, no one knows why it was actually created, and a game set in this time period could answer those questions. Plus, as a bonus, during the Marathic Era, the elves ruled the land, so we could see elven races front and center. So there you have it. Some general thoughts about when the Elder Scrolls 6 may take place, and those are just a few of probably hundreds of events throughout Elder Scrolls lore that Bethesda could decide to flesh out even more in a new mainline game. What are your thoughts? Are there events in the lore that you would like to see Bethesda explore further? What are they? Let's discuss in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, maybe click that bell icon, and as always, thank you so much for watching.